Welcome back to the Comfy Chairs, a podcast from 123 Limited. This is Kate. Have you ever heard a leader say, or said yourself, "Don't bring me problems, bring me solutions"? I have wildly mixed feelings about this common leadership attitude. I agree with and deeply dislike it all at once. On one hand, employees ought not to expect their leaders to resolve every single issue for them. On the other hand, leaders can't expect employees to have the experience, information, or perspective to always identify solutions independently. The fact of the matter is that problem solving is not one size fits all in many ways. A leader's role in problem solving changes as their responsibility increases, and evolving team and individual circumstances and expectations can mean new and novel problems and the need for variable levels of support. Exploring the nuanced relationship between problem and solution and the roles we can play in addressing both is a fundamental leadership practice. I'm fortunate to have the chance to discuss this topic with somebody who has studied how people at work solve problems, Jamie Flinchbaugh, author of People Solve Problems: The Power of Every Person, Every Day, Every Problem. Welcome to the Comfy Chairs, Jamie. I'd like to give you a moment to introduce yourself, please.
Yeah, thanks for having me on the show. Glad to be here. I'm a 5-time founder, co-founder. I've acted as a board of directors, advisor member 10 times. I've invested in 30 startups, and then through my consulting and now advising work, I've worked with over 300 companies, ranging from Amazon to Intel, Fidelity to BMW, and lots of smaller companies you wouldn't know. The biggest chunk of that was 15 years acting as co-founder of the Lean Learning Center, where I co-wrote The Hitchhiker's Guide to Lean with Andy Carlino, and that's where I worked with many of those companies. It was education and consulting. After I sold that business, I spent some time on the executive team at Qorvo Semiconductor, helping lead a transformation, cultural, structural capabilities of that company. And then in 2020, I started what I do now, which is called J Flinch, where I act as an advisor, coach, and thought partner for executives. I like to say smart people working on hard problems. And I wrote the book People Solve Problems during that time as well. As most of the stuff I work on, which ranges from strategy to culture to leadership to org design, ultimately we're always solving a problem at some level in working on those things. And I'm there to help frame, reframe, change the aperture, change the vector of someone's thinking as their thought partner.
Yeah, I was tempted to ask a really obvious question, but what got you interested in problem solving? And I think your introduction answers it really at the end of the day.
It did, but I'd add to that. I as through my lean work that I did for almost 30 years now. Well, actually over 30 years now. Really, problem solving is at the core of that. But what really intrigues me about problem solving is that most of what we're doing when we're doing new is problem solving. So it's a truly human condition, human capability that reflects, work, but, personal lives as well. So one, it's a human condition. Two, we all do it, but we're not very thoughtful about how we do it. And so that makes it interesting. And then three, for me as a topic, is it can take you into so many different domains and industries and fields and challenges that it just keeps me learning, which is my, the fuel that keeps me going. So that's the more selfish side, but it comes along with my interest in problem solving.
You've got to have fun while you're at it, right? Like if there's not something to keep you going, why bother? I I never like to assume that everybody knows all the terms that we're tossing around. And while most of my audience is in business and has probably had exposure to lean, I do know are some people that may not be really familiar with it. So this is kind of an impossible question. I recognize that, but can you give us the 25 words or less definition of lean?
Sure, I'll do my best. And so I spend less time doing lean or even talking about lean these days. It's more just it's influenced how I think.
Yeah.
But what we most know about lean comes from extractions or extrapolation from the Toyota production system,
yes,
which has made Toyota very successful over many decades. And it reflects a combination of behaviors, capabilities, and processes that come together to make an organization more effective, more efficient, and more engaging for employees. So that's maybe not a prepared definition, but hopefully a concise one.
I like the way you talked about it, that it still continues to inform. And I think that's the power of systems like lean, that they can inform our thinking. So even if we're not following everything to the letter per se, although of course there are times for ultra compliance to form,
Sure.
But taking and being able to learn the way of thinking, it ends up serving us later, for example, in problem solving. I'm curious to know, because I have such mixed feelings about it, what is your thought and reaction to that don't bring me problems, bring me solutions attitude that I feel it's become pretty prevalent in the modern workplace?
Yeah, it comes from a good place. It comes from a place of ownership. We want you to own the problem and get somewhere and go take control of it and go do something. But fundamentally, I think don't bring me problems, bring me solutions. Certainly, we don't want the cat leaving the mouse on the doorstep kind of thing, and just running away. But I think it misses two major points. One is many individuals, especially at the individual contributor level, don't have the full context or all the levers and buttons that they would need access to provide the most powerful solution. So at best, you can make a recommendation, but again, you're missing the context. You don't know everything.
Yes.
You're not supposed to know everything, and so two brains are better than one. And so, just quickly connecting back to Toyota, every problem is required to be visible. The minimum number of people involved in solving a problem at Toyota is 2, where in many organizations, the minimum number is 1, which means you can have tunnel vision and short-sightedness and again, lack of context and things like that. So I think that's the first problem with it. The second is that it robs you of a chance to both coach, but also get insights into how that person thinks about problem solving, right? And so if I were to take a sort of an obvious overreaching analogy, if you tried to coach sports by just looking at, well, yeah, we won today. Like, you don't watch the game, you just kind of go, yeah, we won. Okay, now let me give you some advice. You need to see how we won or lost to actually coach a team, right? And the same is problem solving. I can't see how you think and how you work with only seeing the results of your problem solving and the solutions. And so it robs us of that evaluative option and that input of coaching. So to me, those are the most dangerous gaps in that. Now, I will say you take it too far and you say, I'm only going to focus on sort of the effort and the process. And I've seen many organizations that essentially you get credit for starting a problem solving effort. And so everybody's working on 5 problems, but nobody ever finishes one. And in the end, the goal is to finish, right? And get results out of it. And so, so I think it's not a binary answer, but you take either one too far, and it's counterproductive in my opinion.
I agree. I totally agree, which is fortunate for our purposes, isn't it? You've introduced something that really aligns with how I was organizing my thoughts, getting ready for our conversation today. There is, I think, this very interesting balancing act when it comes to problem solving. That there's the, should I focus on the problem, focus on the solution? Is it effort or outcome? The notes I sent you, I shared that I personally think that problem solving is not a skill, or rather it's a skill set or a packet of skills. And as I started to codify those for myself, what I saw is that there are these binaries that kind of hold each other in tension, that you have to have realistic, you have to be realistic when you face a problem, but you also need to be imaginative, creative, innovative, all those great things. There needs to be courage to stand up alone, to try something untried. But you also want connectedness, other people around you, being able to tap into the hive mind, if you will. And then I think the last is great problem solving somehow blends being methodical with being adaptable. And when those things are all well balanced, in the middle, you end up with great thinking, I believe, but also ideally really effective problem solving. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. And I know that you said you're kind of tool agnostic when we first spoke, but interested, are there resources that you would point people to as they're trying to learn how to work in that middle place?
Yeah. So first, I agree. I don't think of problem solving as a skill. I think of it as a combination of skills, and I think many of us have different strengths in the problem solving set, right? And so that just to go back to a point we were talking about earlier, it increases the value of having more than one person involved, because there's no chance that you have the best skills in all the set that makes problem solving work. Let me just start. I do agree. There's such a plethora of different skill sets that you bring to the table. There's bound to be some poles that you have to move forth between as you go through problem solving, whether it's as an individual or as a team. Even just being process focused versus intuitive focused, right? You need both of those. It's an and, not an or. So let me just sort of pick up on that first one around that you mentioned, being realistic, but also being imaginative. So I think realistic comes into play in particular at the front end and the very back end. So at the front end, I think you have to really frame the problem in a way that represents what gap you're trying to solve, and that has to reflect reality. What is the gap we're observing? Not just a gap we're imagining. Right? I'll get many people that start imagining problems, which, if we go to the Stoic philosophy, is, they say that the imagined problems are worse than the real problems, because we build them up. So what's the observable condition? And then at the back end, you need to know, when you have a plan to go solve a problem, who's going to do what by when, and did it work, right? Those should be very objective, very realistic, right? Who's going to do what by when? I like to look at, does everybody have what they need to fulfill their commitments there, right? Or is it you have a plan and you're already having doubts whether you can pull it off? Well, maybe it's not realistic, and we have to talk about that. On the more imagination side, I'll start on the most obvious part, which is the solution space. That's where your imagination and creativity can be really, really useful. And one of my favorite I'll say techniques or tricks when I'm sort of coaching somebody or being their thought partner on a problem is to stretch them to the extreme. And it's like we may not implement the extreme, but we may learn from the extreme that we can then incorporate some of those ideas back into what we end up with. So I'll give an example. I was working with a client who's evaluating their manufacturing footprint. Where, you know, what plant sizes do we need? How do we want to operate? What's connected to what? Those basic questions, not basic, they're core questions. Very, very hard. But I say, well, what if you bought a new piece of property, designed a new facility from the ground up that had everything in it the way you'd want? What would that look like? If you think about, okay, what's the unconstrained extreme answer? What do I like about that I can incorporate back in my more realistic answer? And so pulling in those skills, the imagination and creativity with the realism, it's not just front end, back end, but it's sort of different moments of time. How do we sort of bounce between those two poles and leverage both of them?
Being able to imagine the path that led to the outcome, the gap that you're seeing, is such an important skill. I'm reminded of kind of the root cause analysis fable, if you will, where somebody observes their mother or their wife, somebody cooking a ham, and she chops the end off of it. Well, why do you do that? That's how my mother did it. Grandmother, why do you do it that way? Well, that's how my mother did it. And what you're eventually able to come to is the understanding that the very first matriarch in this line of cutting the ham off, is she had to do that because her pan would only fit so much. And it's led to this gap and this action that was unnecessary. So it's I'm going to chase after it. I'm going to imagine what could have caused it is important. I think too, I had this like, I need to put a little footnote in when you were talking about realism being at the start and the end. One of the skills, one of the needs of great problem solving is working the right problem. And I think sometimes in the rush to come to solution and resolution, the time that's needed to really scope the problem, if you will, gets left out. So how do you help people hit pause, not forever, but long enough to ensure we're actually addressing the thing we need to address?
Yeah, so I think there's two phases of that. One is sort of pre-problem selection, and the other is post-problem selection. The pre-problem selection is the fact that we all have way more problems available to us than we would ever have time to go solve, right? And so this is why I'm a big fan of using terms like, let's put a Band-Aid on, because you're like, yeah, I'm just gonna get through that one, and I'm choosing not to solve it today.
Okay.
And so if we look at our inbox, if we look at meetings or metrics or customers or just our own, here's the things that I'd like to be able to go do that we can't today. There's so many problems available to us. And so as a leader in an organization, I try to focus on how do we build a system, however informal or formal that system is, to manage the problem landscape. That's all the problems that are opportunities. And there's so many people that like they look at their inbox in the morning, and that sets the tone for the day, because they're just going to solve the stuff in their inbox. Meanwhile, there's much more important problems to solve sitting elsewhere that they didn't even consider in the problem landscape. There's a guy, John Dewey, he's understated. He's sort of considered the father of scientific thinking. And he used to say a problem well stated is a problem half solved.
Yeah. And
the point is spending time properly framing the problem is super important. And it can lead to, if you take the time to do it, sometimes you realize, no, we actually don't even have a problem. Like, we just have a complaint. Like, we just have something we didn't like. but the gap isn't very definable or something that's we really want to go solve. I guess I don't have a singular way to coach this, but um, a lot of times it comes down to what will be true if some version of that, where if we close this gap as you've defined it, what will then be true? And that sort of reflects to, is this problem worth solving as I've stated it so far? Because it will change my life or my team or my company in a meaningful way, or it won't. It'll just be a gap that's gone away, but it really didn't change anything.
Well, what I hear you talking about, if I can, with respect and apologies to Dewey, it's a need identified is a problem well stated in some ways, that you've got to be able to articulate this is the change or the different thing or the new thing that I need as a result of addressing something. And if I can then back myself from that desired state to the current state, it can help me, to your point, make certain I'm in the right trajectory.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And there's sort of two ways to frame that gap. One is what we would call gap to standard, which means we were already there and we've slipped, right? So I'll just stick with my one example of I have too many hours on my plate a week. Is I used to be able to spend 3 hours a week doing X, and I've missed that 5 weeks in a row. So that's a gap to standard. We were there, we had a standard, we've lost it. And that's easier to define the magnitude of the gap because we were already there.
Yes.
The other one is gap to need, as the term you used, and that's more an opportunity or the goal line changed, right? So you may have a customer who basically has raised the bar on you, and it's like, hey, we were performing here, and now we need to perform here. And so that's sometimes harder to define because we just know we need to be better, but better isn't magnitude. And so if someone is unable to define the magnitude of the gap today, I go as far as encourage them to write it out with like underline fill in the blank. Like somebody says, I need this process to be faster. Well, then the problem statement should be, it currently takes blank and needs to take blank. And now we still know there's a gap, and we can jump into it and start studying it and understanding it, because maybe the answers to blank and blank, or X and Y, are in the study, right? So we may not be able to define it just yet, but at some point along the way, we kind of need to, because we need to know how much better we need to get in some way, shape, or form. Even if it's an estimate, I'm okay with it being an estimate, but like, what's the gap? How big is it? Matters a great deal.
One of the points you made very early on, sir, was that when we focus too much on the bring me solution, we're missing the opportunity as leaders to get insight into how people think and to guide and coach them through that problem. And I'm hearing some of the, here are ways to coach people through problem solving and what we're talking about. I'd like to get a bit more explicit to say, here are good practices to coach problem solving. Defining the problem being one, being able to talk about the gap in some measurable way seems to be a second one. What else?
So let me start with a couple sort of high-level keys to get right around coaching. One is you have to be clear about when you're in a role of coaching and when you're not.
Thank you. Yes.
So like if you're a manager coaching your employee, they own it. They own the problem. They own the solution. They're moving forward. You're the coach. But at some point, they might decide to do something absolutely wild that you're just like, no, we're not gonna go there. So no, I think the solution to this is we're gonna fire our biggest customer and walk away from them, and then that'll simplify X, Y, and Z. It's like, hold on a second. No, we're not going there. But in that moment, you've become the manager, and that's fine. That's perfectly okay. Right? It's just like a parent and a kid. Like you let your kid roam free and learn, and it's like, hey, I want to put my tongue on this hot stove. That might be a experiment bridge too far. Like, let's not do that. I'm going to be in control of your decision making in this moment. And so, when am I the coach? When am I the manager? And just being, okay, even if you can verbalize it, it makes it even better for both of you.
Yes.
Hey, I'm going to overrule you on this one. I want to give you the leeway, but I'm not okay with this as your manager. So I think that's clear, super important. When am I the coach? When am I not? The other aspect is that you can't just coach at the end. And I would get asked to do this all the time. They bring me their problem solving effort. Like, hey, what do you think? It's like somebody showing me their fully grown child and who's moved out of the house and be like, hey, do you have any parenting tips? I'm like, So you really need to be involved along the way and more front loaded, right? More the very beginning and through the first half of the work. And so, so what are your touch points, right? And I like to distinguish between cadence-based touch points, meaning, hey, we're going to meet every week and we're going to talk about this, or come to me at the end of the day and we're going to talk about this. And so it's based on a cadence, and then the other is event-based. Like, hey, I'll go do this work, and when you're done that, come back to me. And that's more milestone or event-based timing. So you have to be involved along the way. Yeah, I had somebody once. He was trying to be a coach to his team, and I was his coach. And he was asking me, hey, I'm coaching them, but they're really not getting the solution I want them to. I'm like, well, why'd you delegate this problem? If you're really passionate about this solution, then why'd you even delegate it?
Because I'm supposed to delegate.
It was, he really shouldn't have. He should have just said, I'm really passionate about this being the answer. So I should just go do what I want to do as a leader of this team.
Yeah.
So we have to be careful about being too leading, because we do put the coachee, especially if we're the manager of them as well, in a position where they're choosing between following our advice and not following our advice.
Yeah.
Instead of choosing between what solution do I think is the right one, A or B. That's a different decision. But we've reframed it as, follow Jamie's advice or ignore Jamie's advice. And it's a different decision to make. And I think shortcuts or short circuits some of their learning opportunity.
Yeah. There is something I want to kind of annotate, if I may, because I have known people managers that sometimes work a little bit too black and white. That when you talk about, you can't review the work after it's done in this type of case. Don't bring me your full-grown child who's out of the house. That we're not advocating for telling your teams anytime you have a problem, you must come to me first.
Right.
That's not it. It's when you recognize I have an opportunity to coach someone, get in there early with them. Be clear that you're coaching. Ask questions rather than tell. Don't lead them, because you're helping them build the skill set that will let them function somewhat independently of you. And you need them to have freedom. It's not about micromanaging. It is about managing. Period. Right. Okay. Yeah, I have trained and talked with a lot of managers who, unfortunately, because it's what they've experienced themselves, that they would hear something like that and be like, well, everybody has to start their problems with me. And I don't think that's what you're saying. And I'm personally not supportive of that. You do need to have them bring the problem and say, this is where I'm at and working on it. Here's the help I need.
Yeah.
By and large.
Yeah, and I think there's uh, there's different ways to parse that. So I certainly don't think it's every problem.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think you can maybe own the decision in many cases, and that's why I talk about building that problem-solving landscape system so that there's some controls or guardrails on
Yeah.
selecting what problems to work on. But yeah, being involved in every problem is a lot, and often too much. So when you parse it, I think it's you either parse it by individual or you parse it by problem.
Correct.
And and so you parse it by individual and say, okay, these people I'm just managing, but I'm going to invest my coaching time into these two people um, because they have potential and I really want them to elevate or whatever that might be. Or you kind of go, oh, these are the problems that are really messy and are learning opportunities. So those are the selected problems I want to be a coach on. And then I would add to that, you also have to know yourself as a manager. We aspire to always be a coach, but sometimes we're not very good at being a coach and manager at the same time. And and so whether it's short term or long term, I've seen plenty of cases where it's like, yeah, I'm not going to coach my own employees. I'm going to whether it's get them a coach from the outside or ask someone outside the team to coach them
Mm-hmm.
or inside the team even. But I'm going to ask somebody else to coach them, and I may coach people on their team. Right? We may trade like, hey, I'm going to
Mm-hmm.
coach two of your people, you coach two of mine, because on the problems that I'm ultimately accountable for, I'm just not good at letting go enough that I can just coach and let them go. So as soon as I get involved, I know myself and I'm going to overreach. So know thyself, right?
Yes.
Don't don't put yourself to coach in situations um, where you're almost too vested in the outcome, and you just can't be a good coach then, right?
Yeah.
In those moments.
Mm-hmm. I want to take a moment um, and talk about the distinctions. We've already begun a little bit here, but again, to be very clear, the distinction between a manager, a coach, and I think I would add mentor in there as well, because all of those roles have a part to play in guiding people developing problem solving skills.
Mm-hmm.
So the manager, person responsible for the measurement and management of work, communication, information, consequences, rewards, etc. Coach, focused on improving performance through kind of learning and exploration. It's a clumsy way to talk about it. Mentor, somebody who brings their own experience and knowledge to bear to help somebody learn, both from what they've done well and from your mistakes. There's kind of this confluence of a couple of ideas, both from what we've discussed and some things I've been reflecting on, out in the real world, if you will. About networking and connection and how important those are, but also the question of, as somebody's role changes in the organization, specifically as they increase in responsibility, the way that their relationship with problem solving changes. I'm curious about your thoughts about that. How does, for somebody entering leadership and advancing in leadership, how does problem solving, their function in it, how do you see that evolving? And then I think we need to make certain we're tying in this connectedness again, because I have a suspicion that becomes more and more important the higher up you go.
Yes, and let me touch on that first, and then go back to the evolution. One of the main reasons that we want to make sure, as we said almost at the very beginning of this discussion, sometimes an individual will be missing the context, and
Yeah.
and that leader sees the context where it's, we're supposed to see the context where it's like, oh, that connects to this team, or that function or this other issue, or we have three other teams working on the same problem over there. You just don't know it. Mm-hmm. And so helping establish those connections where they're needed, or helping narrow them when they're not, right? You could be sitting there and saying, oh, we need this from that team. And the leader says, you know what, that team is super busy with 10 problems that are way more important than this one. So we need to figure out how we can solve it as much as possible inside the confines of our team, right? And so when do we need connectedness? When do we need to not rely on connectedness? Making those judgment calls, I think, is a big role of the leader. The further up they go, because you see broader, right? You see more broadly. So going back to the evolution, I'll separate does from should, because this is one of my longest standing points that I feel I have a unique perspective on. Maybe not unique, but a different way of saying it. And it's what I call the 25 problems myth. Most leaders, when they get promoted, let's just imagine it's rarely this small, but it's simple math. They have 5 direct reports who all have 5 problems. The leader then assumes they have 25 problems. And that's the myth. That's the wrong perspective to take. Their team has 25 problems. What happens when we assume that myth and assume that, oh, I've got 25 problems, is we then go inject ourselves, usually in just the biggest ones. Not only do we steal from the team their own opportunities for ownership, for learning, they're closer to the work, so in many cases they may have better solutions or better insights than we have. But more importantly, we are robbing from ourselves the opportunity to go work on the 5 problems we should own. And those are likely, they might be informed by those 25 problems. So I do not want abdication of responsibility. I do not want disconnectedness from those 25 problems. I want a leader to be well informed and familiar with the details and understand the context of all those. It could be, for example, that there's a lot of interconnected problems, going back to your point around connectedness, where we see broken connections. And I need to reorganize my team so that we have strength in that connectedness. To me, when a leader elevates themselves to whatever the next role is, or gets elevated, avoiding that 25 problems myth and focusing on what are the problems that I and only I can solve, that's their opportunity. And it happens every time we elevate, but I believe the biggest gaps, the most prevalent gaps, are when we are first time managing. So that's number one. Our first time in some kind of general manager, president, or CEO, or when we elevate to the senior most role in a function where nobody's waking up thinking about the whole system, right? Because they all own different pieces of it. And so at that level, it's everybody owns a chunk of the system. So I can kind of wake up thinking everybody's got the ball, but who's looking across the system? That's where, you really need to think more broadly. So that's where the problem is magnified, but it's true of almost every promotion people go through.
Perspective taking becomes so important as you go up. And I think that mindset shift can be one of the hardest thing for new leaders at each stage. I've been an individual contributor. What got me here was being really good at getting my results. No, it's not your results anymore that matter. It's the team's results. Mm-hmm. Again, I got good results with my team. That's what got me here. Great. It's not just one team anymore. It's this collection and then a function. You talk the 25 by 25. Sometimes that's not 25 problems. Sometimes it might just be 17. And can I help the team understand how their work is interconnected as well, and that really Joe and Jane are working the same problem. Now go work it.
Yep.
And coach and guide through that. So perspective taking, which I could go back and connect to realism and imagination, because I think that those play very closely with each other too.
Well, if I can maybe jump in on the perspective point,
Please.
because I think there's a an interesting point. This is not in the book. It probably should be. It could be a whole section or at least a chapter, but it's the role of sponsorship. And
okay,
sponsorship is, so using one of your examples, right? Joe and Jane need to work together. Right with that admission, you're saying we need to reframe the problem around how it's inclusive of the two parties and not just your own take on it, right? And so I have a take on it, you have a take on it, but when you put it together, it's got to be a whole different third take, because you're changing the perspective of that problem. And sponsorship is really making sure that a team, whether a team is 2 or 20, is working on the right problem, has what they need to be successful, has the right guardrails, knows what their finish line is, right? And then you're essentially the emergency response, call a friend if there's problems along the way. And I find sponsorship to this point of elevation is people go, oh, there's a VP who's sponsoring it. Well, they're a VP. They've been a leader for a long time. They must know how to be a good sponsor. But there's almost nothing written about it. We don't teach it. We can learn some of it if we're observant and we're paying attention to moments where people are good sponsors or not. So I recently wrote a white paper and actually did a video course for my learning lab on being a good sponsor, because I kind of realized we're putting people in a position of being a sponsor and then not guiding them on how. And so facilitators, team leaders, problem owners are like lamenting the failures of their leaders being bad sponsors. And they actually too often assume, well, they must know how to be a good sponsor. So if they're failing to be a good sponsor, it must be malicious.
Yeah.
Right? Because it can't be ignorance. They can't possibly not know how to be a good sponsor. So they assume malicious intent, which is very, damaging and toxic. And no, it's bad. Like nobody ever taught them.
No, and that is a turtles all the way down problem.
Yes.
I believe that we, being the workplace, people that hire, people that train, fill in the blank, we make the assumption that people just know. How do they know? If you don't tell them, how do they know? It's exactly like everything that we've talked about. There is am I informing people of their responsibility in this and what that looks like? I think we could solve most of the workplace problems that we encounter in the day-to-day if we were more generous with our telling. And I totally agree with you. Sponsorship is fundamental to successful change, innovation, forward movement of any kind, whether it's on the small scale or like the big corporate transformational. And you ask 5 people and you're probably going to get 7 different definitions of it. So we have to define it. We have to explain it to make it very clear what the expectation is. And then we need to prepare people. And if they're not able to sponsor, it's too important to have incapable people. One of the things I think we've been circling around this whole time is that leaders can use what we've been talking about in terms of problem solving for basic performance management. Because we're talking about there's a gap that exists. I expect X and I get Y. How do we close the gap? And sometimes you need to manage it, coach it, mentor it, all the stuff. It's beautifully applicable. And extend the grace, because there could be a reason, more often than not, the reason is ignorance. It's not stupidity. It's not malicious ill will. When we were talking about context a little bit earlier, about I know that team can't take this on right now, that the leader has that perspective. I think a lot of times we talk about that as organizational savvy of like, I can see and I'm connected.
Right.
I have a new phrase I want to play with. I think it's corporate empathy, that I can understand and see the dynamics and the flow of work and have empathy for the teams around me. I don't know that it necessarily replaces the idea of organizational savvy, but I think it brings more of that grace and kindness and support into the workforce that I believe we just can't get enough of.
Yeah, I would say it's either a subset of organizational savvy or a pathway to develop organizational savvy.
Yeah.
And there's another, I forget if this was a blog post or an article I wrote, but I like to write, as you can probably tell.
Yeah.
But it referenced a quote, and I'm not even going to try to do the quote because I can't even remember who said it, but it talked about rigorous empathy. Mm-hmm. And rigorous empathy was like, it wasn't about caring or how people felt or anything like that. Just being like, I need to be curious about why. Mm-hmm. Right. And so, I think sometimes people hear empathy and it's like, oh, I'm just going to, okay, yeah, things are tough over there, so I'll give them a break.
No.
But we still have to do the work, right? So it's like, no, I understand why you're resisting me right now. And so that's I have context, I understand, I can see it. And I still have to overcome it, right? So just because you're going through a rough time over in Department A doesn't mean that I'm just going to go like, yeah, we don't have to worry about this. We'll worry about it next year. No, we have to figure this out together because it's still got to get done, even though you're going through a tough time in your department. How do we do that, right? And so that all feeds into the organizational savvy, around how you approach another team, when you approach another team, et cetera. So yeah. I think the idea of that organizational empathy is a pathway to develop organizational savviness.
Well, yeah, I think it's also a little concerned I may be pulling us wildly off topic, but I love this concept. So I think we should be talking about empathy in the workplace more often than we do even. So I'm going to just chase after this topic.
Sure.
That we, just like with, we don't define sponsorship well, I don't think we define or understand empathy well. Like, oh, I'm empathetic. That doesn't mean that I give you a free pass for bad behavior or poor performance or not getting the work done, as you said.
Right.
That I can be aware of, sensitive to, and have insight into whether it's emotions or workload or circumstances. That doesn't mean I don't step into the hard conversation. I don't make the assignment. I don't do the work. It does inform how I approach you. And, things like, hey, they've got buckets of work already going on. We know they have to take this on. Can we negotiate the time frame? Can we help with some other things? Can we ask them to do, half of it now and half of it later? That's an act of empathy, and it's always connecting back to what does the work require of us?
No, I agree with that statement, both parts of it, the fact that we need more of it and the fact that it's often misinterpreted of, like I said, being soft, right? Mm-hmm. And passive and things like that. And it's not. I think if we can think of empathy less as a mindset and more of a process or an act, I think it helps because it's not just sitting there passively being empathetic and going and imagining things, right? It's like, oh, I bet they have a hard week. I'll leave them alone. We don't just be passive in empathy. We can be super active in empathy, but be curious about, allow for, understand, ask questions, right? And then make decisions based on that context. So, I'm not sure I've articulated it that way before, but I think if we think about empathy a bit from a process standpoint, how do we act empathetically as opposed to just be empathetic, um, I think it maybe unlocks some of that misinterpretation that people have.
I agree. I totally agree. And I think what we've landed on here is this confirmation of so much of leading, problem solving. One could probably make an argument that all leadership is problem solving, just like you could make an argument that all leadership is change leadership. But it's working in that space in between two ends, right? Finding the balance between care and need, finding the balance between realism, imagination, courage, connectedness, all the way down.
Yep, I agree. I think that's that does bring us pretty full circle to again that role of the role of the leader in problem solving ecosystem, not just problem solving the act.
Yeah, but I appreciate that very much, and I think too. Another full circle that we're getting to experience by landing on empathy, not as the end all be all, but as an essential part of the process. It takes us back to one of the things you said very early on, that problem solving is truly a human condition. It's, I think we're kind of made for working through problems in a lot of ways. And because it's a human condition, let's treat each other kindly while we're doing the hard things.
Yeah, I and I think including ourselves in that, because I think we often assume, have been problem solving my whole life. I'm in my 20s or 30s or 40s or 50s or whatever. I use my own case. I was trained as an engineer. I should be good at problem solving at this point.
Yeah.
And so then we don't give ourselves permission to learn more and be vulnerable in our problem solving capabilities. I actually like to use, as extreme as it sounds, I still think it's true, the analogy of breathing.
Okay.
We've been breathing our whole lives as well. And so we can take it for granted. But whether it's, you get an athletic trainer who teaches you how to breathe differently while you're doing whatever sport, or you're taking a meditation practice or a yoga practice and they're teaching you how to breathe, and you realize how much you didn't know about breathing and how much more there is to breathing and how much more you can learn about breathing. And then in the same sense as breathing, while we can do it while being unconscious, literally, to do it well requires conscious effort. You don't just suddenly just breathe in meditative stance because while you're sleeping or while when you wake up. You have to be thoughtful about how you breathe if you want to breathe differently. And problem solving is that same thing.
Mm-hmm.
We have, again, you can learn more no matter how long you've been doing it. And we have to be thoughtful and conscious about how we're doing our problem solving, even though we've been doing it for decades.
I cannot think of a better way to end. Honestly, Jamie, that is chef's kiss perfection. You can do it, but if you want to do it better, be conscious about it. I love it.
Yep. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. That being said, I do like to end asking if there are any final thoughts, last words. I definitely want to give you an opportunity to talk about, we've mentioned a couple of the books that you've authored or co-authored. You made reference to your learning lab. I'd love the opportunity to have you spotlight that for us because it looks pretty juicy. I was looking at it just yesterday and would love to be able to feature that for listeners as well. So why don't we transition to some of those housekeeping end of conversation items?
Sure. Well, I guess, we covered a lot of ground, so it'd be really hard to rehash, much of that. But I'd just say I think people should be curious about, what are they missing in problem solving? No matter how good we are, is it breadth? Is it depth? Is it a swim lane over different types of problem solving? There's just always it's one of the reasons I wrote the book, People Solve Problems, to force myself to think critically about some of these topics. So even if I didn't publish it, I still wanted to write it. So be curious, because more to learn out there, no matter how far you've gone. And then, my Learning Lab it's really a tool I first developed for my advising clients. So, and I have plenty of content on YouTube, but this is really for the sort of highly developed, video course content of stuff that I'll say I have behind a firewall, because I really developed it for my clients along the way.
The more learning stuff we can put out in the world for people, the better. And I could go on and on and on about the whys and wherefores of that. But again, we'll spare. I want to thank you again for your time, Jamie. This has been, for me, a very thought-provoking, wheel-turning conversation. And I'm really energized by some of the ideas that you've helped me discover, but also flesh out for myself in my own thinking. And I know that listeners will have the same experience with it.
Well, thanks for being willing to invite me into your sandbox to play and engaging in a dialogue with. It always is always a fun opportunity just to talk with somebody in a curious way without a script. So thank you for inviting me and having the conversation.
Definitely my pleasure. Thank you so much. Thank you for joining me in the comfy chairs. If you're enjoying this podcast, don't forget to subscribe and share it with others who are passionate about leading and learning. And don't forget, if you have a question for our new Comfy HQ series, I'd love to hear it. Check out the link in the show notes to submit your question and be part of the conversation. Until next time.